Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're really tearing into a fascinating idea, potentially revolutionary, actually, in education. Open source brainpage learning.
Yeah, it's quite something. We've been digging into some really compelling material, mostly centered around Shiva Narayan's work. Specifically that piece, Open Source Brainpage Learning, the future of education.
Right.
And our mission really is to kind of cut through the noise for you, pull out the key insights, the real nuggets from this model that blends neuroscience, collaboration, and this idea of student-driven learning.
Yeah, it feels like it's taking everything we thought we knew about teaching
Yeah,
and just completely flipping it, putting the learner right at the very center.
exactly. So let's jump right in. The material starts with a pretty sharp critique of, well, traditional learning
Oh, yeah,
methods.
we all know, right?
Yeah.
Listen to the lecture, try to cram the facts, take the test.
And then forget most of it a
Yeah.
week later. Yeah.
And the argument the source makes is that this model is just, fundamentally, it's outdated. It doesn't align with how our brains actually learn best.
It really doesn't. It treats the student like a passive bucket to pour information into, which, often leaves them feeling disconnected or just lost.
Yeah, the focus seems to be all on the teaching, the delivery, rather than the learning itself. The messy, active thing that has to happen inside the student's head.
That's the core issue highlighted. So if that's the problem, what's the fix? This central concept, the brain page school, what exactly is that?
Good question. The source describes it as a place where students aren't just consuming knowledge, they're actively, well, building it, like instructors, not just listeners.
Okay, building knowledge. And the output isn't just memory stuff, it's these brain pages.
Right, brain pages. It sounds a bit, I don't know, abstract. What are they, really?
Think of them less like notes and more like the student's own mental blueprint for understanding something.
Okay, like a map.
Exactly, a dynamically created mental map. It's the internal structure they build themselves to connect ideas, hold knowledge deeply, designed for actual use, long-term retention, not just, acing a test and forgetting.
Okay, that makes more sense. But how does a school environment actually support that kind of active building? It can't just be unstructured chaos, surely.
Oh, absolutely not. And that's where this thing called the Learning Transfer Management System comes in, the LTMS.
LTMS, okay.
The source calls it the brain's learning engine, which is maybe a bit dramatic. A better way to think of it might be like intelligent scaffolding.
Scaffolding, I like that. It gives support, structure, but doesn't do the building for you. So how does the LTMS provide that?
Well, the material explains that the LTMS gives students structured ways to do the things that neuroscience tells us are vital for making strong memories. Things like hands-on tasks, guided practice,
Right.
and really importantly, collaboration. It moves learning from just listening to actively doing.
And the payoff for that. What benefits does the source point to?
They're pretty significant, it claims. It naturally boosts teamwork because building these brain pages together deepens everyone's understanding. It brings needed structure to a classroom where students are taking more charge. It fosters real independent thinking because they're the ones grappling with the material.
Uh-huh.
And it gives them the freedom to really explore ideas deeply, but still within a framework designed for, effective learning that actually transfers.
So it sounds less like pushing info at the brain and more like creating the right conditions,
Yeah.
the right tools for the brain to build its own understanding, kind of how it naturally wants to work anyway.
Precisely. That's the idea. And feeding into this structure are a couple of other really interesting concepts. Miniature schools and these things called Zeid factors.
Okay, miniature schools, what are those about?
Right. So these are described as small, sort of fluid, student-led groups right there in the classroom.
Student-led.
Yeah. And their specific job is to collaborate intensely, solve problems together, debate concepts, and actually co-create those brain pages we talked about. It's like peer-to-peer learning, but formalized as a core part of the system.
Interesting. And these are powered by Zeid factors. What on earth are those?
Yeah, the name's a bit unusual. The source calls them the emotional motivators. This is where the neuroscience connection gets really interesting.
Okay.
These factors are about tapping into what makes a student tick emotionally. Their natural curiosity, maybe a personal interest, something that gives them a sense of purpose or a challenge they want to overcome.
So emotion isn't a distraction here.
Quite the opposite. The insight is that emotion, when it's harnessed the right way, is like the ignition switch for deeper learning. It boosts attention, engagement, memory. It makes learning feel like a meaningful quest, not just a mechanical chore you have to get through.
Okay, so connecting this back to the core science, this brain page theory, what's the underlying neuroscience supporting this whole approach?
Well, the fundamental idea is that the brain isn't just a passive recorder. Real learning, the kind that sticks and you can actually use, happens when the act of learning physically changes the brain. It structures or rewires neural circuits.
Right. Building new pathways, strengthening connections.
Exactly. It's a physical process based on experience.
So the methods used in these brainpage schools, they're chosen specifically because they help make that physical structuring happen.
That's the claim. The source points to several key methods. Using visual memory, because our brains are great at processing visual info. Motor practice involving physical action helps ground abstract ideas. Cognitive structuring, that's the active mental work of organizing the info. And, like we just discussed, emotion-based motivation, which amps up attention and helps encode memories.
And combining all those.
Right. Combining those is supposed to build that deep, long-lasting, usable memory, which is very different from just cramming for a test and having it fade away.
Okay. This seems to lead to what the source calls a pretty radical idea. Teaching without teaching. What does that mean in this context? Sounds counterintuitive.
It is perhaps one of the biggest shifts proposed. It doesn't mean teachers vanish, not at all. But it means the traditional role teacher as the main source, the dispenser of all knowledge that's gone. Instead, students are empowered. They're actually trained to lead their own learning, actively building their brain pages, using the LTMS tools, working within those miniature schools.
So the teacher's job completely changes.
Completely. They shift from being the sage on the stage to the guide on the side, more like a facilitator, a coach, maybe a mentor.
Providing resources, helping troubleshoot.
Exactly. Making sure the learning environment works, enabling the student's effort, not doing the learning for them.
Now, the other key part of the name is open source. We hear that a lot in tech, free access, collaboration, building stuff together. What's it mean for learning?
It's definitely used metaphorically, but with a very practical intention. Just like open source software makes powerful code accessible for anyone to use and improve.
Right, like Linux or something.
Yeah, exactly. Open source brainpage learning means the methodology itself, the structures like LTMS, maybe even some learning modules, they're designed not to be proprietary, not locked behind big paywalls.
So it's not some expensive curriculum only wealthy schools can buy.
That's the core idea presented, stemming from Shiva Narayan's vision, that this potentially powerful approach should be accessible. The phrase used is every student, every teacher, everywhere. So the open source part here is positioned as a way to break down barriers in education, build bridges, and make more effective learning available globally.
Okay. The research, as laid out in the source, it really boils this down into some key takeaways. There are 10 specific points mentioned.
Yeah, they do a good job of summarizing the whole philosophy. A few really jump out right away. First, learning is brain-centered, not teacher-centered. That's the absolute foundational shift.
Okay.
Second, open source makes learning accessible, which tackles that equity issue we just touched on.
Right.
And third, brain page modules deepen memory, directly linking the process to the desired outcome, real, lasting learning.
And the building on the structure and collaboration aspects.
Well,
What else?
number 4, miniature schools develop leadership because students are actually running their own learning groups.
Makes sense.
5, LTMS provides structure, that crucial scaffolding. 6, teaching without transfer doesn't work. A reminder that just saying stuff isn't teaching if the student can't actually use the knowledge later.
Yeah, that's a critical point. What about the rest?
Okay, number 7, Zide factors spark engagement. That's the emotional motivation piece. 8, teachers evolve into facilitators, that necessary role change. 9, the model can scale globally, partly because of that open source accessibility. And finally, 10, it supports holistic development, mind, behavior, performance, because it engages the whole student, not just their short-term memory.
Wow, that list really ties together all the threads we've been pulling on. It shows how these pieces are meant to fit together. So stepping back, what's the ultimate goal, the bigger vision behind this whole brain page system?
Well, the goal isn't just about getting better test scores, though presumably that might happen. It's really about cultivating lifelong learners. People who have both the skills and the internal drive to keep learning, to think critically, solve new problems, adapt, in the real world, long after they leave school.
The kind of people who can actually thrive out there.
That's the vision. It's presented not just as a different teaching technique, but as a fundamentally smarter, maybe more human approach to education, precisely because it tries to align with how brains are actually built to learn.
So that naturally brings us to the practical side. If a school or an educator or even a policymaker is listening and thinking, okay, this sounds interesting, what are the first steps the source suggests?
Yeah.
How do you even start?
They do lay out a pretty clear pathway. It begins sensibly with brainpage learning workshops for teachers and students so everyone gets a feel for it firsthand.
Right, getting hands-on seems key. Then what?
Then, practically, things like actually setting up miniature schools within existing classrooms and starting to introduce LTMS-based learning tasks, taking concrete steps to build the core structures.
And that crucial philosophical bit involving students right away as leaders in their own learning, giving them that agency.
Absolutely. Plus, providing access to any available open source learning modules is vital for empowering them. And of course, that big one, rethinking the teacher's role and providing training for them to become effective facilitators, not just lecturers.
It sounds like fundamentally it's about shifting the training focus, teaching students how to learn effectively, how to manage their own learning process, not just what facts to memorize for the next test.
Exactly. And the source frames this whole thing not just as like a potential pilot program for a few schools, but more as a movement, a call to join a push for broader global education reform based on these principles.
The closing thoughts in the material are pretty strong. Build smarter classrooms, not harder ones. Let students lead. Let learning flow naturally.
Yeah, aligning with how the brain actually works.
And that final, really concise call to action that sums it all up. Build a brain page. Lead the change.
It's definitely provocative. So maybe thinking about everything we've covered, here's a final thought for you, the listener, to just sort of sit with.
Okay.
If we truly committed to this idea, that education is primarily about the student actively constructing knowledge inside their own brain, using methods grounded in neuroscience, rather than mainly receiving information passively from a teacher, what would that truly mean for the basic purpose and design of schools themselves, everywhere? How fundamentally might that shift the entire experience of growing up and learning for future generations?